Dr. Ruth Morgan is an environmental historian and historian of science with a particular focus on Australia, the British Empire, and the Indo-Pacific. She teaches in the School of History at the Australian National University in Canberra, where she is also the director of the Centre for Environmental History. She is vice president of the International Consortium of Environmental History Organizations. Her current research includes experiments and traffic of environmental ideas between the British Empire and Australia in the 19th century, and water and making of urban Australia in the 20th. She has published her work in Journal of Urban History, Environment and History, and History Compass, to name a few. She is co-author of the book titled Cities in a Sunburned Country, published by Cambridge University Press in 2022. And we are looking forward to her new book titled Climate Change and International History from Bloomsbury, which is due this year. So with this, we extend a warm welcome to Dr. Ruth Morgan, and over to you, Dr. Morgan, please.
Thank you very much for such a warm welcome, and especially to you, Vishwajit, for a very generous invitation to join you all today online to share some of the ideas that I've been working on for a little while. I hope you can see my slides now. Is that okay? Perfect. All right, fingers crossed. And thank you all for making time in your day to join us. And I look forward to any comments or feedback or questions after the talk or online later. So thank you very much. So allow me to set a scene for you. On September 27, 1884, some 288 camels disembarked the SS Bengal at the government jetty of Port Augusta in the colony of South Australia. Onlookers gathered as one by one, each camel had a sling placed under his belly and secured over his back, with a steam winch lifting him off his feet. We see Anglo-European men in this photo, garbed in Western suits and hats, staring as South Asian camel handlers, dressed in turbans and robes, herded the camels onto the banks of the Gulf. These handlers were among the 56 Afghan attendants, as they were known, in the employ of Akbar Kusha, who was a business partner of the local camel merchant Charles Chewings, who had together sailed from Karachi via Colombo and Albany just over a month earlier. These scenes were to become familiar sights in the Australian colonies. Within the decade, Chewings could declare, quote, "The camel, the Bedouin life, and the Great Plain of Central Australia are all well adapted to each other, and one can now see Oriental life in Afghans, camels, and tents as truly as in Arabia or Western Asia." So great was the volume of the camel trade and their reproduction that by 1895, the neighbouring colony of Western Australia had double the camel population, which is about 4,000, of the colonies of South Australia and New South Wales combined, at about 1,500 and 500 respectively. What I want us to focus on today is the emergence from the 1860s through to the 1930s of the configuration of a borderland of the arid and semi-arid Australian interior by the traffic of camels and their human handlers from South Asia. To understand the formation and nature of this camel assemblage, two distinct marginal areas of the British Empire must be brought into a single analytical frame. British India's northwest frontier on the one hand, and the arid interior of the Australian continent on the other. Both were ecologically and economically barren, at least as far as Britons were concerned, but they were each geopolitically significant to the 19th century imperial projects of securing the northwestern frontier of British India and ensuring the settler occupation of the entirety of the Australian landmass. The former, with its mountains, deserts, and tribal peoples, was a source of enduring insecurity, just as the aridity and Aboriginal peoples of the latter really tested Anglo-European aspirations for what we might call holding country. Making explicit the political and ecological relationships between these areas reveals the historical contingencies of making an Arid Alliance, the making of camel country. British interventions in South Asia directly shaped the contours and timing of Anglo-European incursions into the Australian interior, while economic, environmental, and political change in the Australian colonies drove demand for South Asian camels and their handlers in return. This camel-associated movement of South Asian biota and capital across the Indian Ocean has invited closer scrutiny that has both challenged and enlivened their Australian study. Informed by the scholarship of ecological transfers, subaltern studies, and spatial approaches to imperial history, this work centres the agency of South Asian and Indigenous humans and non-humans to shed new light on the making of this Arid Alliance. Although settler Australian contemporaries tended to group South Asian handlers as Afghans for their own convenience, these people reflected the many cultures of the territories that comprised British India and its northwestern borderlands, as well as what is now Afghanistan. From this perspective, camel country was not spatially bound to arid Australia, but rather spanned the ports of the Indian Ocean and the hinterlands of South Asia. And nor was camel country the sole creation of Anglo-European or imperial endeavour. Rather, it was also shaped by the mobility, labour, faith, and capital of South Asian people, and importantly, the camels themselves. For all the camel's characteristics that likely favoured its chances in arid Australia, its frustrations elsewhere, such as the United States, indicated that its biophysical characteristics alone were no guarantee that they would flourish far from home. Familiarity and reputation mattered, perhaps more often than the often cited similarities that contemporaries like to promote of the climate and terrain of the Australian interior and the northwest frontier of British India. I'll go back to that map. In this regard, James Heavier has demonstrated the extent that British forces relied on thousands of camels, mules, and horses in the South Asian borderlands, while the exploitation of resources in the Australian interior warranted the import of camels and their South Asian handlers. Although the number of camels shipped to Australian ports pales in comparison to the scale of their military engagement in British India, the contemporaneous concern with the camel's physiology and its application to imperial ends warrants our closer investigation that centres the interspecies empire that configured these environmental borderlands. Tonight's paper, or tonight for me, I should say, focuses on the role of the camel in projecting imperial power into the Australian interior, from the revival of shipments from British India in 1883 until their end in 1907. In doing so, the camel, as the only practical means for non-Indigenous peoples to traverse this challenging region, it was critical to the construction of this area as an imperial borderland. Now, as I will explain a little further, the camel's introduction to Australia had had a faltering start and showed few signs that they would thrive. Since the 1820s, the potential utility of the camel to the imperial project in Australia had been the subject of some discussion, both in the metropole and the colonies. An inquiry from the newly founded colony of South Australia in 1840 was the first to prompt the camel's Antipodean chapter. Of the 6 camels that departed Tenerife in July 1840, only 1 bull survived the voyage to South Australia. In the colony's Flinders Ranges 4 years later, Aboriginal people were described as having seen, quote, a huge monster. To them, it was an incomprehensible monster. It was at last concluded to be Whitefellow's emu, end quote. The New South Wales Surveyor General had summarised the challenges of exploring the Australian interior to London's Royal Geographical Society in 1837. He wrote first the necessity for carrying all provisions, tents, bedding, and so on. Second, the scarcity of water. And third, the mischievous disposition of the savage tribes. The Society's president reiterated arguments for the camel's aptitude to the first 2 tasks. Quote, a thorough exploration of the interior of Australia will never be affected until we import thither camels from our eastern possessions, and thus at once get rid of the vast difficulties attending the want of water. Soon afterwards, Indian-born explorer Charles Napier Sturt reflected on the trials of his third and final expedition into Central Australia in the mid-1840s. Quote, "I cannot help thinking that camels might have done better, not only for their endurance, but because they can carry more than a horse. I should undoubtedly have been led to try those animals if I could have procured them, but that was impossible." Sturt's expedition had unfolded in the wake of the First Anglo-Afghan War from 1839 to 1842, which had exacted an enormous toll on the camels of the Army of the Indus. As a result of overloading and overwork, combined with a diet of unfamiliar plants and shortages of feed, camels had died in droves. One observer estimated that between Quetta and Kandahar, 20,000 transport camels, or 2/3 of the animals sent into the field, had been lost. But during this campaign, the camel did make an impression on the Secretary of State for War and the Colonies, who wrote to the New South Wales governor in March 1841. He said, "Considering the peculiar nature of the Australian continent, the vast extent of unexplored the want of water, and particularly the long journeys which must be undergone by land from one colony to another, I think they might be found very applicable, as well as for purposes of discovery, as for a means of communication, and that it is a subject well worthy of your attention and encouragement." The only obstacle, as far as the Secretary could see, was the greater coldness of the climate in the southern parts of Australia. And certainly 2 camels that had arrived from Tenerife and were displayed in Sydney could likely attest to that assessment. But whether there would be camels to spare in British India's borderlands was another matter. Britain was engaged in the simultaneous maintenance of several arid borderlands in both India and Australia, which consequently left camels in short supply. According to a correspondent of the Bombay Times, quote, "We have already extinguished nearly 1/3 of the male camel population in these parts, and we are now busily engaged in annihilating the hopes of a future generation," end quote. This author also noted the pressing of younger animals into service and the unprecedented use of female camels in Sindh and Baluchistan, where no labour of any sort was ever assigned to them. That the British were purchasing rather than hiring these camels did prove consequential for the beasts of burden. Fearing disloyalty from their owners, with whom the camels shared a close relationship, the British had brought handlers from Punjab and Gujarat, whose unfamiliarity with the desert animals in their care proved disastrous for that military campaign. So I'll just change a slide and we'll come back to some of these figures shortly. Oh, there we are. So as the acclimatisation movement began to take shape in the Australian colony of Victoria in the late 1850s, camels found new and influential champions in Australia. Among them was the local physician and parliamentarian Thomas Embling, who is depicted on the slides, who deferred to the expertise of a correspondent of some 14 years' residence in India. Having undertaken the journey, he wrote, from Karachi through part of the desert of Sindh onto Peshawar with heavily laden camels. This informant gave Embling the confidence to declare in the colony's local newspaper, "I hope, sir, that we shall arrive at a determination to solve the problem of our own Sahara by the aid of the only animal qualified to bear us triumphantly through the arid wastes of the desert." In this newspaper, Embling likely found a sympathetic ear. A leading writer and reviewer and later editor had been born and raised in Calcutta, and while its owner had advocated locally and in London for acclimatising animals in Australia, and had founded the colony's Acclimatisation Society in 1861. This correspondent of Thomas Embling was George James Landells, who had boldly proposed to import camels and other dromedaries at the expense and risk of the Victorian government from the mouth of the Indus. He was about to return to Calcutta with a consignment of horses for the Bengal army, and the camels would provide the financial means for his journey back to Australia. The Acclimatisation Committee responded enthusiastically and commissioned Landells to purchase 24 camels to establish a stud in the colony, of which 18 should be dromedaries, the single-humped camel, and 6 the two-humped Bactrian variety. But that latter specimen was simply too difficult to procure because they would have to be obtained from Dost Muhammad Khan's Afghanistan, where neither European explorers nor officials were willing to venture after the humiliation of the First Anglo-Afghan War. So Landells instead had to embark on a very long journey through British India's northwest borderlands to procure some 15 Bikaneri camels in Rajasthan, a Makrani from Multan in the Punjab, and 10 Khorasan from the Khan of Kalat in Baluchistan, which was by then under British control. And once he procured the requisite number, his caravan set off to the port of Karachi at a rate of some 60 miles a day, which was very impressive according to the local press in Australia. Then from Karachi, eventually he sailed on to Melbourne with a menagerie of creatures, including the 24 camels for the government, another that was his own pet, as well as 9 native camel attendants. Now, by this time, the Acclimatisation Committee's secretary, once sceptical of their utility for transcontinental exploration, had changed his tune. Quote, might not the camel's track across the continent guide their flocks, the harbingers of a new colonisation to oases of our inland wastes, and lead them on and on until by peaceful conquest we raise another Indian empire in continental Oceania. Now, by this time, the exploration of the interior of the continent had become newly urgent, as the South Australian and Victorian colonies competed to establish a telegraph route to the continent's north, where it could then be connected with a submarine cable to the so-called Indian archipelago of what is now Indonesia. Camels had not been part of the original plans for Victoria's effort in this regard, but they really caught the interest of the local public when they arrived, and they were celebrated, and this led to their deployment. Some enterprising merchants had in the meantime exported some additional Egyptian camels from Yemen, apparently, and these smaller creatures also joined what became a party of 26 camels that joined Landells and the other members of what would be the doomed expedition of Robert O'Hara and William John Wills through the east coast of Australia, through that interior passage. And unfortunately, they did not succeed in this journey. Well, I should say the explorers didn't succeed. Some of the camels did survive, although they are difficult to trace. So having accompanied the South Australian expedition to search for these doomed explorers of Burke and Wills, this was an adventure of its own, trying to find the explorers. Pastoralist Thomas Elder returned to his station in South Australia's north, convinced now of the camel's important value. He had earlier travelled by horse and camel from Cairo to Suez in 1857, and he condemned his expedition's leader for failing to rescue the survivors of the Burke and Wills effort. He said McKinley had camels with him and could have managed it easily. And Elder dispatched his business partner to Karachi, where he met with, quote, respectable native Khan Bahadur Murad Khan in 1862. We have his nephew on the screen here, who is an important source of detail about some of these dealings. And the Khan, 4 years later, arranged for a shipment of over 120 camels and over 30 Arab attendants, as they were called, to Port Augusta. The camels were apparently the fast or Makrana camel for riding purposes, the hill camel from Sind, suitable for riding or baggage, the hairy camel from Kandahar, which were fine, strong, and thick set, and the best kind for heavy loads. At elders' stations in South Australia, the camel population had more than doubled by late 1871 under the care of South Asian handlers, who would return home to South Asia to be replaced by another group of handlers after completing the terms of their contracts. Under the charge of Jemadars, Buha Khan, Haimullah Mirburn, and Asala Khan, groups of camel handlers travelled back and forth between Karachi and the port of South Australia. Having proved themselves over any country where no horses can live, these camels and their handlers Elder hired out to his government for the construction of the overland telegraph line in the early 1870s, and then to exploration parties after they joined the 1873 expedition of the former British Indian Army officer, Colonel Peter Egerton Warburton. This was the first expedition to use camels as the only means of transport and might have failed entirely had it not been for them. In the wake of Murad Khan's death in Karachi and prolonged drought in South Australia, no further camels in the Australian colonies arrived until late 1883, when the Siren docked at Port Adelaide with 6 adult camels, 3 bulls and 3 cows, and 8 Hindu attendants, as they were called, from Calcutta. Since Elder's shipment of camels had departed Karachi in 1866, the northwestern borderlands of British India had remained contested among the region's local and European powers. Fearful of Russian influence over Central Asia and the allegiances of Afghanistan's ruler, Britain embarked on what would become the Second Anglo-Afghan War. Although British forces fared better than they had during the first such war, the campaign's camels again sustained heavy losses to the extent that they were probably, quote, the principal sufferers from the forward policy in Central Asia, as Malcolm Yapp has observed. In the intervening years, the Australian camel population had grown to 700. Their esteem was now such that the South Australian sheep inspector could observe, quote, large tracts of country will always be difficult to travel over, and there can be no doubt that the enterprise of those who have entered into the camel industry will be rewarded. And those seeking to enter that industry could look beyond Elder's operation to where contemporaries agreed were the best camels produced, Afghanistan. In the wake of the Second Afghan War, the imperial borderlands of British India and the Australian interior were to become newly culturally and ecologically enmeshed. Let's have a quick drink. The significant loss of camel life along British India's northwest frontier quickly became a source of debate, and their welfare a cause for concern among veterinarians serving in British India. Their reappraisal as worthy of compassion rather than contempt reflected a wider trend of British empathy towards Indian animals, which Pratik Chakrabarti has demonstrated was associated with notions of imperial benevolence and paternalism. In short, of the camel, British veterinary science knew very little. The British were, quote, horsemen and not camel men, as one veterinarian put it, and they relied on the expertise of the local camel drivers, who they then blamed for the camel's suffering. Despite the changing landscape of British camel knowledge that arose in the aftermath of this Second War, there is very little evidence that these insights were widely disseminated in the Australian colonies. The human knowledge to co-construct with camels the arid Australian borderland would rely on the lessons acquired from the more developed South Asian version. Since the camel trade had resumed in 1883, camels and their South Asian handlers had become increasingly visible in the Australian colonies. In 1884 alone, ships like the Bengal, which I opened the paper with, had imported nearly 700 camels into South Australia, almost doubling their population in a single year. Hevia suggests that such was the toll of the Second Anglo-Afghan War that some local camel owners, with or without their own camels, had left for Australian ports. And if I just go back to one of my slides, which I'm sorry about the order here, Among the South Asian people whose biographical details have an Australian record are at least some, such as these gentlemen, who had served the British in South Asia and East Africa. There's also the increasing familiarity that some European Australians had developed with camels, arising from a contingent from New South Wales who fought in the Sudan. Now, drawing them across the seas were fresh opportunities emerging in the Australian interior. Already, the camel's record there indicated that developments in the arid areas of the Australian colonies during the 1880s would favour them and their handlers. With the discovery and exploitation of artesian water in arid areas of Western New South Wales and Queensland, the grassy plains and ranges west of the Darling River, along with the Darling Downs, underwent a rapid economic and ecological transformation, as well as violent Indigenous dispossession. Sheep numbers grew exponentially as pastoralists profited from record wool prices and unusually good rainfall, fenced lands, and dug dams or tanks to water them. Adding to this prosperity were discoveries of gold, silver, and other minerals in the peripheries of the colonies of New South Wales and Western Australia from 1880, which created new resource frontiers in the interior where there were no railways to transport the commodities and no likelihood that building them would prove profitable. It was only animal labour, the horse, the bullock, or the camel, that could ensure the transport of supplies and machinery into the arid interior and the carriage of commodities to ports for export. Pioneering narratives of desert exploration across the Australian interior had extolled the camel's reputation in areas of scarce water supply. Following the deaths of his 3 horses after days without water on the central Nullarbor Plain in early 1875, Giles had observed his 2 camels to have undiminished powers as they survived for 8 days until their party found a small sheet of very white or salty water. Later, David Lindsay, who had experience using both horses and camels in his expeditions with South Asian handlers, I might add, observed that his horses could only carry 120 pounds and travel about 100 miles without water, but camels, however, could carry upwards of 700 pounds and last nearly 3 times as far. And what they were observing was the camel's capacity to use water very economically. Under such conditions, camels rapidly limit the water expelled in their waste. And they also limit their dehydration by allowing their body temperature to rise during the heat of the day and reducing then the evaporation of water through sweat. In these conditions, the camel was no longer an oriental oddity or ornament, but rather an asset. Pardon me. Yet Australian democracy, quote, will have none of the animal, the Sydney Morning Herald newspaper reported in mid-1894. Among the camel's supposed flaws was the tendency for horses to, quote, get into a terrible state of fright and uneasiness when they first encounter the animal or its scent. The camel was apparently not only bad company, it also failed to measure up to the obedient and docile qualities of horses in the colonies, where Anglo-Europeans shared a British fondness for equines. But as a review of one of the pamphlets on the camel observed, quote, the real secret of the opposition to this strange beast lies in his suitability for Australian conditions, especially during seasons of drought, a suitability which has enabled him on many of the Western roads to displace the ordinary carrier with his huge wagon and slow-going team. And this is the gentleman on the screen who made that observation. The camel's value had only increased as pastoralists, squeezed by drought and economic downturn, favoured their cheaper rates for carrying wool over those of the bullock teams and their unionised labour, which had strengthened considerably since the 1870s. As one Anglo camel handler put it, camels are the only motive power that is of any service in times of drought, to which the interior of this country is so subject. That these assets and their labour were profiting South Asian camel owners caused grave concern among many Anglo-Europeans, for whom coloured workers increasingly represented a threat to the interests of the white man. That the camel's use in the Australian interior seemed to depend on South Asian handlers had been a source of tension almost from the outset, and publications in the colonial newspapers really hoped that they would soon be replaced by Europeans. But intimate relations between camels and their handlers could not be so summarily disrupted. Meanwhile, pastoral peoples and practices were becoming more closely regulated in British India, which tended to limit the movement of camels and their handlers through that region and encouraged the diversion of more and more camels to the Australian colonies. So Anglo-European objections to the role of South Asians generally appear as protests against what might be termed unfair competition from animals that were far more efficient than the horses and bullocks on offer from the Unionists in the colonies. Agitated that South Asian handlers were charging lower rates than their Anglo-European competitors, they complained that camels could be fed more cheaply than their own horses and bullocks. In Western Australia, for instance, a local newspaper put it thus: "The camel lives on what he can pick up in the bush, his harness is made by his attendants, and he requires no assistance from the shoeing smith. How then can the white man compete with him?" Explorers had marvelled at the camel's diet as they browsed more widely on plants than horses, sheep, or cattle, not least as they could reach foliage more than 3 metres above the ground. Giles had observed, for instance, that, quote, "there was not a sign of a blade of grass or anything else that horses could eat, except a few plants of coarse description, and those they did not care very much for. The camels, on the contrary, could take large and evidently agreeable mouthfuls of the leaves of the great bushes of a legume which abounded." On another expedition, an anthropologist noted, "None of these Central Australian plants, which are as spiny as they will be, are in the least thereby protected against such an animal as the camel, which will with relish munch away at the most thorny acacia just as readily as it will feed upon the juicy claytonium." And where feed for the camel was scarce, they could draw on the reserves of fat they stored in their humps. That the plants they browsed and the waters they drank in the interior were often saline posed no problem to them. Indeed, camels relish those sources of salt. They require almost 6 to 8 times the amount of common salt considered adequate for other livestock, and their kidneys can produce highly saline urine. Ensuring an adequate salt intake was imperative for camel handlers. As one British veterinarian pointed out, that grazing should be given when practicable. Some grain daily is good for the animals and should be flavoured with salt. Although many Anglo-European contemporaries marvelled at their capacity to endure scarcity and to drink brackish water, the camel's water consumption in the arid interior was also a cause for antipathy. Already by the 1880s, the indigenous people of the Western Desert knew that camels could empty their waterholes and avoided contact with the Anglo-European expedition parties or attacked them. The explorer David Lindsay, for instance, noted that at one waterhole, he had allowed his camels to drink as much as they wanted, which was up to 4.5 gallons each, and filled his own vessels up 15 gallons. In arid Western Australia, access to scarce water supplies were the grounds for hostilities towards South Asian peoples and practices as contaminants on the goldfields. One observer wrote in 1893 that the camels and Afghans are the filthiest lot that ever went near water. Around some of the wells, the ground is little short of a manure heap reeking with filth. You can find the Afghans washing their dirty linen on the edge of the well, and the splashes of suds falling out of their buckets go into the well. Later, the founder of the local Anti-Asiatic League declared that in light of the scarcity of water in those parts, such behaviour was tantamount to manslaughter. And so, with calls to severely punish Asiatics who so wantonly and systematically polluted the wells, the tensions over water there soon boiled over. And we have an episode where an argument between Anglo-Europeans and South Asian camel handlers over the use of a waterhole for ablution culminated in gunfire. 2 of the South Asian camel handlers were shot, which killed one and wounded another. And in the subsequent trial, though, the jury found the Anglo-European shooter not guilty. And so with South Asian appeals for greater protections on the grounds of shared imperial citizenship falling on deaf ears, some South Asian camel drivers advised his colleagues to camp their camels far away from the wells to avoid such violence. In spite of the growing Anglo-European hostility toward them, camels and their handlers were nevertheless co-producing camel country around and through the arid interior of the Australian colonies, carrying heavy loads across vast distances. They sometimes conveyed those distances not in geographical terms, but in camel time. So we have an example from 1893 where the South Australian Postmaster General enters an agreement with South Asian camel proprietors, Faiz and Taig Muhammad, to transport provisions along the overland telegraph line. And it specifies that a total of 37 tonnes of supplies was to be delivered on camelback over the course of the northward journey to the telegraph repeater stations throughout the centre of Australia. And the agreement interestingly specifies the anticipated time that such a journey bearing the load should take, which has been calculated from their departure point. So we have 3 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, and 16 weeks. Earlier in the Simpson Desert, our explorer David Lindsay records his own expedition's journey on the camels, not only in terms of his bearings, his geographical bearings and miles, but also in terms of the minutes between each bearing. And so I think these examples of attending to physical distances in camel time could have been inspired by the work of James Rennell, who was the first surveyor of Bengal, who in the 1790s had used the camel's regular and reliable pace to calculate distances in regions where obtaining the celestial fixed points was especially difficult. Always deemed well suited to the arid interior, camels and their handlers also left their own marks on the landscape as they connected ports and railheads to distant missions, pastoral stations, mines, townships, and telegraph stations. Near Burke in Western New South Wales, bicycles could more easily traverse the black soil plains once they had been compacted to a hard surface by passing camel trains. Along those camel paths, plants that might not otherwise have grown there were also taking seed. We're not entirely sure how some of these plants arrived in the interior from their South Asian origins, but researchers speculate that many accompanied the camels themselves as companion species. So camel dung, for instance, might have helped to spread the #1 camel feed, a kind of acacia that hails from Africa, Central America, and Southeast Asia. Another means of plant transfer was likely the camel's saddle, because no matter the handler, riding camels in the Australian interior were generally fitted with leather or hessian saddles that were padded with straw or other fibre. Ecologists estimate that such saddle padding was responsible for accidentally introducing around 16% of weed species into the arid interior, including kapok, callitrope, and bufflegrass. We also have examples of South Asian handlers themselves bringing seeds through the interior, such as the date palm, which was apparently brought from Afghanistan and cultivated in northern South Australia. Now, as you might imagine, in the decade after the resumption of camel imports, Anglo-Europeans began to argue in favour of another kind of camel, the Australian bred variety. As native-born Anglo-European Australians became statistically dominant and politically vocal, Orientalist and social Darwinist ideas influenced the emergent nationalism of the 1890s, for which the rural interior was becoming the focus of settler Australian ideals. Mirroring sentiment in the metropole and around the empire, These concerns for animal breeding and bloodlines blurred considerably with concerns about racial difference and civilizational progress. As the colonies of South Australia and Western Australia established their own government camel breeding stations, settler commentators also advocated for Anglo-European camel handlers. There is no earthly reason, said one correspondent, why the Afghan and the camel should go together. In Western Australia, one politician in support of immigration restriction argued, now it is recognised that white men are equally well able to manage these beasts of burden and can carry out the operations better than Afghans. Characteristic of their concerns was the treatment of camels at the hands of South Asian camel drivers, whose use of the nose peg they deemed particularly cruel. The Australian press reported the publication of John Kipling's Beast and Man in India in 1891, in which he perpetuated a myth from the Second Anglo-Afghan War that camels, quote, were deliberately sacrificed by their native owners who were guaranteed compensation for their loss. This was published in the wake of the extension of cruelty against animals legislation across British India, and his work helped to reinforce the post-1857 uprising characterization of South Asian peoples as cruel and barbaric, in contrast, of course, to the humane and just ways of, quote, the ordinary Englishman, who himself had likely accrued his camel knowledge from those very peoples. Since the turn of the 20th century, colonial and then Commonwealth regimes of surveillance and the control of the mobility and livelihoods of South Asian peoples had greatly curbed their participation in the settler economy, just as quarantine and stock imports curbed the movement of the Surra parasite and other diseases across national and state borders. This trend was accelerated by the steady development of a transport infrastructure based on the locomotive and the automobile. Under such unfavourable circumstances, camel owners frequently released them into the bush, where they did so well that they were subjected to both eradication operations and expedient employment still today. By following the tracks or pads of camels and their handlers from northwestern borderlands of British India to those of the Australian interior, this paper excavates the human and non-human contingencies that shaped the making of camel country. It reveals a far richer and nuanced history of political and ecological entanglement that accounts for the migration patterns of camels and their South Asian handlers across the Indian Ocean and shows the extent to which imperial concerns about security and settlement in these distant borderlands were co-constituting interspecies affairs. Finally, I hope that by centering camel cultures in this study of these two parts of the British Empire, that I've shed some light on the ways that non-humans have historically negotiated and defied human boundaries for their own ends. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is so rich, this is so insightful, and this expands my own horizon beyond the obsession with the Indian tiger, elephants, and my own area of research on the rhino. But I thank you again, and this is time. The participants might want to field questions to the speaker, and if you have a question, please raise your hand on the Zoom app, and I'll unmute, or you can also type your questions on the chat box. Okay, so if I may ask a question, In at least one of the slides, I could see, if I'm not grossly mistaken, I could see even the Anglo-European handlers of the camel. Were the camels just carrying the Anglo-European people, or they were handlers, or was there a very neat kind of division of labor, racial division of labor between the two groups, South Asian and Anglo-European? On the past slides, it's a colored slide. I think that's a
I think,
painting, it seems.
let me see, let's go back.
Yeah,
Is this
yeah.
example perhaps? So this is from a exploration party, and we don't entirely have that division of labor. It's still a bit blurry at this point. I think we have a kind of competing camel knowledges at work in this particular expedition, where this was one of the first to use camels extensively. But I think you're right. We have not only a racial division of labor, but also a class issue where wealthier whites are using the camels as the means of mobility in some of these arid areas. And I think there's also an aspect of novelty and kind of ornamentalism going on here. But certainly Anglo-European handlers were developing their own skills, or at least trying to, but remaining very heavily reliant on that South Asian knowledge for the duration of the period.
Thank you. And we have a question in the chat box by Saili Gupte, and there are two questions, it seems. The first one is, shall I read it for you, or are these visible to you?
Well, I can read it. I can read it out. So the first question is about what is really happening with the camels in Australia today. Are they a wild population? And yes, Australia has a incredibly large population of what is often called a feral, the feral camel. They don't belong to anyone in particular. And they thrive more or less in the interior of the country, so much so that they actually are the subject of sometimes controversial campaigns of destruction. So they are culled, so that they are less of a problem in terms of the damage that they are seen to do to private property, and that they are also known to be quite confident, and it's a problem in terms of entering small townships and getting into drinking water supplies, even into air conditioners, which also require water. And so they're seen as a menace in that regard. But in a recent episode of camel control, there was a really quite strange or surprising, I suppose, to Australians, that a group of Somalians in Africa contacted Australia and said, please don't, destroy the camels. We'll take them. We want them. It was such a terrible thought for those people that Australians would not value the camel in the same way that they would. And I believe there's often camels exported from Australia to places like Saudi Arabia, because the camels that are in Australia apparently have a valuable bloodline. They're probably not affected by the kinds of diseases that might afflict camels in their original countries, and so that makes them quite valuable. And onto your second question about the hybrid variety, no, I believe they are not hybrid. I think they are sort of the original kind, mainly because I couldn't get into whether or not we could discern which ones used to be riding camels and which ones used to be load carrying camels, but they are all single hump. So there is probably, to some extent, I guess, an Australian variety that is developed that way, but my understanding is that we don't distinguish them beyond just the particular species. I think Shari had a question.
Bishojit, can I go ahead? Or
Yeah, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Hi, Ruth. Thank you so much for that very fascinating exploration into camel country. I was very intrigued by, I think, towards the end when you said there was this settler colonialist who, in the debate, in wanting to move away from the interchangeability of camels and Afghans, saying that, oh, we can deal with camels better than Afghans. That was very fascinating, that comparison itself. And I was wondering if there were contradictory or similar kind of glimpses before these decades when this association was still intact, the association of South Asians and Afghans with the camels, how they were perceived and how the inability of other people, of white colonialists to deal with camels, how that was framed. And I was wondering especially if it was framed in terms of a certain kind of Orientalist nativism, that because these are racially inferior groups, they are better at dealing with, engaging with beasts of burden, and then moving that debate, in terms of the debate, away later to suit their own needs. And the other, again, curiosity question was, you mentioned the acclimatization debates in the mid-19th century, and I mean, similar debates are happening with different human racial groups in the different colonies, especially South Asia, and the inability of, say, white settlers or white colonialists, white British, to acclimatize to the tropics, and those debates. So I was wondering if there's a link between these two debates because they're happening around the time. Thank you.
Right, they're really juicy questions. Thank you. I'll start with the how perhaps those understandings of the camel handlers changed over time, and I think there is, I suppose, all sorts of. There's probably not a dominant representation coming through, and certainly I think there is a real curiosity initially, as some of the artwork that emerged from this particular expedition suggests, a real sort of fascination with the clothing and the way of life, and it's very kind of exotic. So there is that aspect, but there's also a very utilitarian and kind of necessary evil way of thinking about the handlers and their expertise. It's recognized really that without these animals and without their South Asian handlers, that much of the work to open up the interior would not be possible, that the Europeans just did not have the experience. They did not know what to do. That didn't mean that they were necessarily welcoming, but there was a kind of an acceptance, a begrudging acceptance of that reality. But as the numbers of camels increase after the 1880s, that's when you really, it coincides with that growing nationalism, and it's very becomes much more explicitly an effort to deny the entry of these handlers, and that, you know, racially we will, as Anglo-Europeans, be able to replace them ourselves. And onto the acclimatization of the animals and the people themselves, it's interesting that you mentioned this, because another sort of case study I've examined is this real kind of concern around what it means for whites in India, particularly around the uprising, and trying to square that thinking with the decline of Indigenous peoples in Australia. Because the argument goes that, well, white people can't thrive in the tropics, they should be able to thrive in the temperate areas. But hang on a minute, we've also got a dwindling Indigenous population, which many commentators did not want to attribute, of course, to settler colonialism. That was, you know, what did that mean then for this climatic reasoning that they were grappling with? So it's quite interesting, the kind of elaborate kind of explanations that they came up with for why this temperate climate would be good for whites, but not for Indigenous peoples. And how they sort of tried to make sense of these things. And I think it sort of speaks to, I guess, more broadly the intersections of this racial thought and climate and environment, that these would be somehow they were all connected, basically, and you know, the same people involved in this acclimatization story are also the ones sending eucalyptus seeds to the Nilgiris. So they're all kind of the same people keep popping up in this story. I guess it's not surprising. They're the ones with the networks. They've got the resources and so on. But it's still, I suppose, as far as a historian's concerned, great that we have some common characters that appear throughout these little case studies. Yeah, thank you. But I will look into, I'll make that sort of thread a little bit more clear, and I think that's something worth picking up in terms of linking chapters together, and when it one day becomes a book. That's really helpful. Thank you. We've got a couple of questions in the chat, which is great. Oh, the trading market of camels during the 19th century, the economic value of the camel. Oh, I have to do a little bit more looking into this. I suppose I would estimate or guess that the camel was quite valuable because of its ability. Well, I should note that a camel alone might not have been that valuable, because you needed the expertise to use the camel like a machine of sorts. You needed someone who knew how to use the camel. So that's where it becomes quite interesting, I guess, when we're looking at how then this affects the views of people towards their handlers. And that value of the camel then starts to decline in the early 20th century when we do see more roads, more railways being constructed, and the changing economic patterns of, I suppose, the value of commodities that needed the camels to carry the freight, the wool, the gold, the minerals. So the camel's value is connected to other commodities and humans as well. Some humans, I should say. And that's something worth exploring too. Thank you. And then we've got a camel cull. Right. So this is a really useful question. I think most Australians, because most settler Australians certainly live on the coasts of Australia where there aren't many camels. The camels are in the middle of Australia, where the human population is much more sparse. So there's not too much, I suppose, awareness of their scale of the population. I think probably because most Australians don't live in proximity to camels, we often feel perhaps sympathetic or curious, whereas people that in Central Australia perhaps see them as much more destructive force or a pest, a nuisance, and that they ought to be controlled. There's also some interesting work that anthropologists are doing on Indigenous connections to camels and how they're connected into not only traditional cultural stories, but also with missionary stories around Christianity. So this kind of mingling of spiritual traditions, which the camel allows, I suppose. It's associated with Jesus Christ and so on. So that's another sort of interesting angle that brings the story up to more recent times as to how Indigenous peoples have made sense of this unfamiliar animal. There's not a camel meat industry in Australia. We sometimes send them elsewhere to other countries where they're used for meat. And milk, though, there is certainly small businesses that try to, I suppose, commodify camel milk, try to make ice cream and so on from camel milk, but it's pretty well, it's an acquired taste for a start, and it's not widely popular. I think it's more of a novelty, which is a shame when you think of, you know, the products of the camel and how many we have. But as I say, their numbers are controlled. They do ebb and flow according to the climate conditions. Often there are long droughts, and so the water supplies in the interior diminish and the amount of food diminishes. So there's a sort of a natural limit to some extent. But when conditions are more favorable, their populations explode. And that becomes a problem. So that's when usually government authorities intervene to reduce their population. Oh, that's really interesting. I really want to go to Rajasthan just to see, you know, another way of handling camels. Be interesting to know how they keep I suppose control them. Ah, interesting. Well, thank you, Amia. That's super interesting. Very different in Australia. They're not really earning much income for anyone. I think if they were, they would be treated entirely differently. So, you know, obviously we have a very different outlook when it's a cow or a sheep in Australia. They're sort of our two important animals. Very different when it comes to camels. Which animals become feral and you know, invasive. Yes, thank you. Thank you for this question about the Bactrian camels. I think the initial, it was a very sort of brief attempt to get the Bactrian camels, the two humps. As you say, they are better suited to colder and more mountainous terrain. And I think this was ignorance. I think that was truly the issue. It was just the lack of understanding that the Anglo-Europeans had of the different kinds of camels and the different aptitudes of camels, that there was an assumption, well, it's all hot, it's all sandy, it's all the same, and rather realizing after trial and error that actually some camels were better suited to Australian conditions than others. So the Bactrian camel experiment was short-lived. Oh yes, definitely massive tourism aspect to camels in Australia. You can have camel rides in certain places. Also, there's a beach in Western Australia, in the north of the state, where you ride camels across the beach and have photographs looking very exotic, I guess is the idea. I don't know how comfortable or romantic it is in practice, but because they're quite tall. So I wouldn't personally be jumping at that opportunity, but yes, big into the tourism, as you say. And people sometimes go on sort of expeditions of their own, they're kind of treks, I guess, into the desert, and they camp and they, you know, sleep close by to the camels. There's also a famous woman well, she was a white woman, I think in the 1970s or 1980s, who travels across Australia with a camel. It's called, I think Tracks is the sort of memoir about that, and it's been made into a movie, and it's her kind of journey of self-discovery through trekking with a camel, which is quite, yeah, it's a great story. So it's kind of got a 20th century novelty and appeal, but it's interesting that it's a white woman's self-discovery and what we might draw from that experience. A question from Guha.
Hey.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you so much. That was a fascinating talk. I actually did not even know about the camels in Australia. So this is a completely random question, and I've been trying to figure this out for quite some time. So I did my undergrad in the veterinary college, so I'm a vet by training. So during that time, we heard a story which was very interesting about the Reds in the cattle, which was so it's a Gujarat cattle. It's very adapted to very dry environments and everything else. and they said that it had been imported to Australia and it was doing really well. In the 70s, when the government of India started this whole white revolution to improve the Indian cattle, there was a lot of artificial insemination that was going on. And so what happened was that they lost a lot of pure Indian breed bloodlines. And so when they realized that actually like this Holstein Friesian, yeah, they gave 30 liters of milk with like 50, 100 liters of water, which was not going to work in Gujarat. So then they apparently woke up and they realized then that they didn't have any pure Red Sindhi lines left. And so the story goes that the Indian government went back to the Australian government and got pure Red Sindhi lines back to India. Now, this is a story that we heard in the veterinary college. It was repeated so many times. You know, we almost took it as gospel truth. But I've been looking for any information about the veracity of the story, and I've not been able to find it. So when you talked about your camels in Australia and there being like important bloodlines and everything else, I was just curious if you had come across any information on the Indian government re-importing Red Sindhi cattle from Australia.
No, I haven't. It hasn't jumped out at me, but that's not to say that something as strange didn't happen.
It is such a wonderfully strange story. You know, it's for so long. So
I think I mean I'm now curious myself. But I think what is sort of interesting for me, I suppose I'm always sort of interested in these international kind of connections for little old Australia, is how active these agricultural agencies were in terms of connecting agricultural researchers in Australia to places in India, often in the drier parts of the country during the 60s and 70s, parts of Egypt, parts of Israel. So it is possible that happened. I mean, I didn't think about the animal connection. I do know about the efforts in terms of plants, and, you know, wheat breeding and so on, and irrigation and that kind of thing. So maybe, I mean, there were certainly so many kind of creatures brought to Australia sort of during the 18th and 19th centuries that it's possible that there were some kind of valuable bloodline. I mean, even certain sheep and goats were sort of prized because they were so hardy, and there's sort of this weird sending it back to where it kind of came from as a kind of development kind of project, really. So I think there could be a kernel of truth. It might have been maybe not that species or not that place, but I think something might be there.
Yeah. In case you come across anything, I'll email you. I'll get your email from Vishnu.
Please. Yes.
Thanks.
Put it on the final slide. There you go. Thank you. And I'm very interested, Amia, in your land categorization in arid lands. That does tickle my fancy. I'm super keen to work on those sorts of questions in my next project, which you know, I shouldn't jump onto new projects when I haven't finished the ones I have, but it's always tempting to be pulled in new directions.
Thank you so much for this session. I'll definitely be getting in touch.
Great, thank you. Thank you. I look forward to that.
Yeah. We are, I mean, we've just exceeded a couple of minutes, but I cannot restrain from requesting you to pull up one of the slides where the elephant was dragging a camel carcass. Could you please do that, if you don't mind?
Yes. Oh, there we go. Yes. So grim. So grim. The really incredible.
I could not. What interests me is who probably would be the Uzi, the elephant handler, the Mahout? South Asian?
I'm guessing, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this follows from the racial stereotype that elephant handler has necessarily to be a South Asian, and Europeans are unsuitable to the purpose. And in the camel's case, we find an instance where the Europeans exceed this prejudice that certain handling can be actually appropriated. Right? So this is a stark contrast to the elephant, which was also of paramount importance in terms of the colonial resource appropriation, creating resource frontiers like Burma and timber frontiers in India. So, yeah,
That's an interesting contrast and worth drawing out. I suppose it's again that knowledge, it's that aspect of labor. I imagine it might come to some extent of that limited British knowledge of animals that weren't horses, which maybe that's just in reference to the camel, but it is interesting, as you say, which human expertise is kind of becomes like drawn into Western science, so equine knowledge, and what other kind of animals remain, I suppose, orientalized and outside that thinking.
Yeah.
I will think more about the elephant.
But thank you so much. And on behalf of Moturi Satyanarayana Center and Krea University, I thank you for your really, really rich talk. We look forward to your published work, and hopefully we'll have a copy of it to read. We also look forward to your book on climate change and international history, and we look forward to stay connected. And Professor Mahapatra had another engagement, so he has excused himself just past your the first set of questions.
That's okay.
Yeah, and on behalf of him and the entire center, we thank you once more. See you again.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for your really engaged and interesting questions. I really appreciate this.